When the jeep was stopped by two pickups with armed men on a deserted road between Hurghada and Safaga, the guide received $3,000 in cash and turned the car back, leaving the two Polish tourists in the hands of the kidnappers. After 48 hours, both girls were sold to different Bedouin families for $4,000 each and disappeared into the eastern Egyptian desert. Kasia and Magda arrived at Hurghada International Airport on April 21, 2021. They bought tickets through a Polish travel agency that offered a week-long package with hotel accommodation, transfers, and diving in the Red Sea. Both girls were experienced divers and had been traveling together regularly since 2017. Kasia worked as a graphic designer in Warsaw. Magda was 24 years old. She was in her final year of university studying international relations. They flew on a direct flight from Warsaw. The flight time was about 4 hours. Egypt in April 2021 was just beginning to recover its tourism industry after the pandemic. Restrictions had been lifted, but the flow of tourists remained significantly below pre-pandemic levels. Hurghada, the largest resort city on the Red Sea coast, depends almost entirely on tourism. The local economy had suffered over the previous year. Many hotels were operating at minimal occupancy. Guides and excursion companies were competing for every client. Prices for services had dropped, attracting budget tourists from Eastern Europe. The girls stayed in a 3-star hotel in the tourist district of Hurghada. For the first 5 days, they spent time on the beach and did 3 dives with an instructor near the shore. The weather was good. The air temperature stayed around 32 degrees. The water had warmed up to 24 degrees. Visibility underwater was excellent. They saw turtles, rays, and a multitude of tropical fish. At the hotel, they met other tourists, mostly from Poland, the Czech Republic, and Ukraine. The atmosphere was relaxed, with no alarming signs. On April 26th, the 6th day of their stay, a local guide named Ahmed approached them. He offered an excursion to a Bedouin village in the desert. Such tours are popular in Hurghada. They are offered by almost all travel agencies. The usual program includes a jeep ride deep into the desert, visiting a traditional Bedouin settlement, tea drinking, camel riding, watching the sunset, and dinner with national dishes. Tourists return to the hotel late in the evening. Ahmed offered a price of $50 per person, which was about 30% cheaper than the standard offers from official tour companies at the hotel. Kasia and Magda saw no reason to refuse. They had read reviews about such excursions online. Music. Many tourists recommended them as a way to see the real desert and get acquainted with the local culture. The guide showed them photos from previous tours, where happy tourists were in a Bedouin village. He had a business card with the name of a tour company and a phone number. Everything looked legitimate. The girls agreed and paid in advance. Ahmed said he would pick them up the next day, April 27th at 3 p.m. On the 27th, Ahmed arrived on time in a white Toyota Jeep. Besides him, there was another man in the car, whom he introduced as his colleague and driver. The girls sat in the back seat. There were no other tourists in the car, although such tours are usually organized in groups of 6 to 8 people. When Kasia asked about this, Ahmed explained that due to the low season, few people signed up, and today only they were going. This didn't alarm the girls, although investigators later noted this moment as the first warning sign. The Jeep left Hurghada heading south along the coastal road, then turned west toward the desert. The road was paved for the first 30 kilometers, then turned into a dirt road. The landscape quickly changed from coastal greenery to bare rocky hills and sandy plains. The car drove for about an hour. The girls photographed the desert through the windows, texted their parents in messengers while there was cell signal. About 45 minutes after leaving the city, the connection disappeared completely. Around 5 p.m., the Jeep arrived at a small settlement of 10 to 15 mud-brick houses and several tents. It looked like a typical Bedouin village shown to tourists. Several men in traditional clothing sat by a fire. Camels stood nearby. Ahmed suggested the girls get out, saying the program would start soon. They got out of the car and looked around. The place looked authentic, though noticeably poor. There were no other tourists there, which seemed strange. But Ahmed explained that another group had already left, and the next one would arrive later. They were offered music tea and invited to sit on rugs by the fire. One of the Bedouins spoke to them in broken English, telling about life in the desert. Everything looked like a regular tourist program. The girls relaxed, took photos, drank tea. The sun began to sink toward the horizon. Ahmed said that soon there would be a sunset and dinner, after which they would head back. It was about 6 p.m. The following events happened quickly. Around 6:30 p.m., 2 pickups approached the village. 4 men got out of them. 2 had Kalashnikov rifles. This no longer looked like a tourist program. Kasia and Magda stood up, instinctively realizing something was wrong. Ahmed spoke to the armed men in Arabic. The conversation was short. One of the armed men pulled out a wad of dollars and gave it to Ahmed. He counted the bills, nodded, got into his jeep, and drove away with the second driver without looking back. All this took less than 5 minutes. The girls realized they had been sold. They tried to run, but were quickly grabbed. Magda screamed, tried to break free, and received a blow to the face. Kasia was held by the arms by 2 men. They were tied with ropes, their mouths gagged with rags, and shoved into the bed of one of the pickups. All this happened in the light of the setting sun in front of the other Bedouins from the village, who did not intervene. The entire operation looked well-rehearsed and routine. Investigators later established that similar kidnappings of tourists in this region had occurred regularly from 2009 to 2015. Then the cases became rarer but did not stop completely. The pickups drove in different directions. Kasia was taken north, Magda northwest. The road was bumpy. The girls were tossed around in the metal bed. Kasia managed to slightly loosen the ropes on her hands but did not try to escape, realizing that in the desert in the dark, there were no chances of survival. The car drove for about 2 hours. When it got completely dark, the pickup stopped at a small settlement of several houses and livestock pens. Kasia was pulled out of the bed, her legs untied, and led into one of the houses. The house was simple. 2 rooms with mud brick walls, earthen floor, minimal music furniture. A kerosene lamp burned in the corner. Kasia was seated on the floor in the back room and the door was locked. She heard voices outside, male and female, speaking in Arabic. After some time, the door opened and a woman about 40 in black clothing entered. She untied Kasia's hands, gave her water and bread. In broken English, she said that Kasia must now work and obey, otherwise it would be worse. She explained that escaping was pointless. Around was the desert. The nearest city was 100 kilometers away. Without water, one couldn't reach it. That first night, Kasia didn't sleep. She tried to understand what was happening, how to contact the outside world, how to get out. Her phone had been taken back in the pickup. The door was locked from the outside. There was no window. She heard people talking behind the wall. Then the sounds quieted. Everyone went to sleep. Kasia cried but tried to do it quietly. She thought about Magda, not knowing if her friend was alive, where she was, what was happening to her. She thought about her parents in Warsaw, who knew nothing and were waiting for messages from the trip. The last message she sent to her mother was around 4 p.m., when they were driving into the desert. She wrote that they were going on an excursion and would write in the evening. The next morning, the situation became clearer. The woman who came at night turned out to be the wife of the head of this Bedouin family. The family consisted of the head himself named Hamdi, his wife Amina, their 3 children, and Hamdi's mother, an old woman about 70. They lived here permanently, engaged in livestock breeding, kept goats and a few camels. The nearest settlement was 20 kilometers away. There was no electricity in the house. Water was taken from a well. They cooked over an open fire. They lived poorly by 21st century standards, almost primitively. Kasia was explained her role. She had to help with household chores, carry water from the well, cook, clean, care for the livestock, wash clothes. Work was from dawn to dusk. They fed her sparingly, mostly flatbreads and water, sometimes goat meat or dates. She was allowed to sleep in the same room where she spent the first night. The door was locked at night. During the day, she was under the supervision of Amina or the mother-in-law. Hamdi and his eldest son, a teenager about 16, were armed, carrying old rifles. It was clear that any escape attempt would be suppressed by force. The first days, Kasia was in shock. She couldn't believe this was happening for real in 2021 in a country where millions of tourists come. She tried to talk to Amina, explain that her family would pay ransom, that she needed to be released. Amina replied that they had already paid money for her, and now she was their property. Kasia was bought for $4,000, which for this family was a huge sum, equal to several years of income from livestock breeding. Amina saw nothing wrong in the situation. For her, it was a normal deal. Meanwhile, in Hurghada, the girl's parents raised the alarm. When Kasia and Magda did not return to the hotel by the morning of April 28th, the administration initially assumed they might have been delayed on the excursion or decided to stay somewhere overnight. But when they still couldn't be contacted by lunch, the hotel staff called the police. The girl's parents in Poland also didn't receive responses to messages and calls since morning. The mothers of both girls contacted each other, then the hotel. By the evening of April 28th, it became clear that the girls were missing. The Egyptian police in Hurghada registered a missing persons report. Initially, the case was handled as a regular tourist disappearance. Such cases occur several dozen times a year throughout Egypt. Most are resolved quickly. People are found in hospitals after accidents in other cities, sometimes simply losing contact and documents. Serious investigations usually begin after a few days if no information appears. The hotel staff told the police about the guide Ahmed and the desert excursion. They gave his business card and phone number. The police tried to contact him, but the number didn't answer. They checked the tour company listed on the card. It turned out that no such company existed. The card was fake. This was the first serious sign that the disappearance might be criminal. The case was transferred to the Department for Combating Human Abductions. Investigators began searching for Ahmed. Descriptions were given by other tourists who saw him at the hotel. The description matched dozens of people. No official guides with that name were found in the databases. They checked the surveillance cameras at the hotel and found footage of the girls getting into the white Toyota Jeep. The car's license plates were not clearly visible on the recording, but specialists enhanced the image. From the plates, they traced the owner, a local resident, who said he had sold the car 2 months ago to some person for cash without paperwork. The trail went cold. The Polish consulate in Cairo got involved in the case immediately. The consul contacted the Egyptian Ministry of Internal Affairs, requesting intensified searches. The story began to leak into Polish media. The girl's parents gave interviews, asked for help, appealed to the government. The Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent an official request to the Egyptian authorities. The case gained a diplomatic dimension. The Egyptian authorities organized a search operation in the desert between Hurghada and Safaga. This is a huge territory, hundreds of square kilometers of desert lands, where dozens of Bedouin settlements are scattered. The police began driving around these settlements, questioning local residents, searching for witnesses. But Bedouins are extremely insular, distrust authorities, and do not give information to outsiders. Most of those questioned claimed they knew nothing about the missing tourists, had not seen any white women. The problem was that kidnapping tourists for sale into slavery or ransom was a known practice in this region since the late 2000s. Between 2009 and 2015, Bedouin clans of the Sinai Peninsula and the Eastern Desert Music kidnapped. According to estimates by human rights organizations, more than 30,000 migrants and refugees from Eritrea, Music, Somalia, Ethiopia. They were held in the desert, tortured, demanded ransom from relatives, and those who couldn't pay were sold into slavery or killed. There were cases with Western tourists, though much rarer. In 2012 and 2013, Bedouins kidnapped several American and European tourists, demanding ransom or the release of prisoners. Almost all these cases were resolved by paying money or negotiations. But after 2015, international pressure and actions by the Egyptian army in Sinai reduced the number of such cases. However, the practice did not stop completely. It went deeper underground. The Egyptian authorities knew about this problem but preferred not to publicize it, so as not to scare tourists. Tourism brings Egypt about $12 billion a year. This is a vital sector of the economy. Any information about kidnappings could damage the country's reputation and lead to tour cancellations. Therefore, officially, kidnapping cases were hushed up or presented as isolated incidents not related to a systemic problem. In the case of Kasia and Magda, the Egyptian police conducted the investigation but without much enthusiasm. Investigators understood that if the girls had indeed been kidnapped by Bedouins, finding them would be extremely difficult. Bedouin clans live by their own laws, do not recognize state authority, have extensive family ties. The police cannot simply enter a Bedouin settlement and conduct a search without serious grounds and permission from elders. Any attempt at forceful pressure could lead to conflict, which the Egyptian government does not want to provoke. By the end of May 2021, the searches had reached a dead end. The police found no traces of the girls. The guide Ahmed was also not found. The official version of the Egyptian authorities was, the girls might have been victims of an accident in the desert, got lost, died from dehydration. Their bodies could have been buried in sand or eaten by wild animals. The kidnapping version was considered, but without concrete evidence, the investigation did not progress. The case formally remained open, but no active actions were taken anymore. The girls' parents did not give up. They hired private detectives, contacted international human rights organizations that work with victims of human trafficking. One such organization, which helped refugees from Africa freed from Bedouin captivity, agreed to help. They had contacts among Bedouins, informants who provided information for money. Through these channels, they began spreading information about the missing Polish tourists. They offered rewards for any information. Meanwhile, Kasia had already spent a month in captivity. She got used to the routine. Rising at dawn, work all day, meager food, sleep on the floor in a locked room. Physically, she weakened, lost several kilograms. Her skin burned and cracked from the sun and hard work. But the main ordeal was the psychological strain. She didn't know how long this would last, whether she would ever be freed, if Magda was alive. She didn't lose hope, but with each day, hope faded a little more. In early June, an event occurred that changed her situation. A man arrived at the house on a motorcycle, a relative of Hamdi from a neighboring settlement. He talked with Hamdi for a long time. They sat by the fire, drank tea. Kasia was working nearby, carrying water. She didn't understand Arabic but noticed that the conversation was serious. After the guest left, Hamdi was thoughtful and silent. In the evening, he talked with his wife. Kasia heard snippets of the conversation but didn't understand the meaning. The next day, Hamdi went somewhere in his pickup and returned only in the evening. From then on, the atmosphere in the house changed. Everyone became nervous and wary. Kasia later understood that the relatives' conversation concerned the police. Egyptian officers had appeared in several neighboring settlements, questioning Bedouins, searching for the missing tourists. Information about this quickly spread through family ties between clans. Hamdi and his family became worried. Keeping a kidnapped European woman became risky. If the police found her here, it threatened serious problems, possibly prison for the whole family. But simply releasing Kasia was also impossible. They had paid money for her, and she knew the way to their house, could lead authorities. In mid-June, Hamdi decided to move Kasia to another place. He arranged with a distant relative who lived even deeper in the desert, 150 kilometers from any cities and roads. There, the police definitely wouldn't appear. The place was so remote that even other Bedouins rarely went there. Early in the morning on June 19th, Kasia was woken up, her hands tied, placed in the pickup bed under a tarp. The trip took about 5 hours along desert trails. When she was pulled out of the bed, she saw an even more wretched settlement. 3 houses made of clay and stones, a pen for goats, a well, nothing more. Around, for hundreds of kilometers, stretched a stony desert. The new family to which she was transferred consisted of an old man about 60 named Salah, his 2 wives, and 5 children of various ages. Living conditions here were even worse than at Hamdi's. Water was scarce. They conserved it, used it multiple times. Food was little, mostly dried dates and flatbreads from cornmeal. Meat was eaten rarely. when a goat was slaughtered. Kasia was given a corner in one of the rooms, locked at night. During the day, she worked under the supervision of one of Saleh's wives, a woman about 40 with a harsh character. There was even more work: carrying water from the well, which was 200 m from the house, washing the whole family's clothes by hand, cooking, cleaning the goat pen, cleaning hides of slaughtered animals. Kasia understood that the chances of rescue were now even smaller. This place was so isolated that even if someone was looking for her, they would never find her here. But she continued to cling to life, did the work, didn't provoke conflicts, waited for an opportunity. She began learning Arabic, listening to the family's conversations, memorizing words. This gave her a small advantage, allowed her to understand what was happening around, what people were talking about. Saleh's younger wife sometimes talked to her, taught Arabic words, explained how to do this or that work correctly. There was more sympathy in this woman than in the other family members. Another 2 months passed. August in the desert was unbearably hot. The temperature rose above 45 degrees during the day. Work had to be done mainly early in the morning and in the evening. During the day, everyone hid in the shade of the houses. Kasia lost a lot of weight. Her European skin was covered with a deep tan and many small scars from wounds and burns. Her clothes turned into rags. She was given an old Bedouin cloak and scarf. Outwardly, she began to resemble a local woman. But the main change was her psychological state. Kasia began to accept the situation as a new reality in which she would have to live indefinitely. This was a protective reaction of the psyche, a way to survive in a hopeless situation. Meanwhile, Magda's situation developed differently. She was taken to another settlement, about 120 kilometers from where Kasia was held. The family that bought Magda was more affluent. The head of the family was involved in smuggling, transporting goods across the desert between Sudan and Egypt, had connections with criminal groups. He had 2 pickups, a generator, a satellite phone. Music Magda was not kept in such strict isolation as Kasia. She was allowed to move around the house freely, not locked at night, but that didn't mean she could escape. The settlement was guarded, around was the desert, and the head of the family made it clear that any escape attempt would end badly. He showed her a pistol that he always carried with him. Magda was lucky in one aspect. The head of the family did not use physical violence against her. He viewed her as an investment, a commodity that could be sold or exchanged later. He planned to either demand ransom from her family or sell her to someone in another country. For now, he kept her, made her work around the house, but the treatment was relatively tolerable. They fed her normally, gave clean clothes, allowed her to wash. Magda quickly understood her role and played by the rules, didn't resist, did what was required, waited. In July 2021, the head of the family tried to contact Magda's parents to demand ransom. He used an intermediary, a person who had contacts in Hurghada. The intermediary called the Polish consulate in Cairo, delivered a message that Magda was alive, held captive by Bedouins, and demanded $50,000 for her release. This was a huge sum for an ordinary Polish family, but Magda's parents were ready to raise the money. They contacted the Egyptian authorities, the consulate, asked to organize the money transfer and daughter's release. But the Egyptian police insisted that paying ransom was illegal and would only encourage the kidnappers. Instead, they promised to conduct an operation to free her if they could establish Magda's location. Negotiations reached a deadlock. The kidnappers didn't want to reveal the exact location before receiving the money. The police didn't want to pay the ransom. Several weeks passed. Contact was broken. The head of the family decided that this girl was too much trouble and began looking for other options. In August, he sold Magda further to a person involved in smuggling people to Libya. The deal was done for $3,000. Magda was taken west, closer to the Libyan border. In Libya in 2021, civil war and chaos continued after the overthrow of Gaddafi. The country was divided between several warring factions. Central authority did not control much of the territory. In these conditions, human trafficking flourished. Thousands of migrants from Africa trying to get to Europe across the Mediterranean Sea ended up in the hands of Libyan gangs, who held them in concentration camps, demanded ransom, sold into slavery, or forced to work. European hostages were rare but occurred. Magda was held in one such camp on the outskirts of the city of Tobruk, near the Egyptian border. The conditions were horrific. Dozens of people in one room, minimal food and water, unsanitary conditions, diseases. She was forced to work on construction, carrying bricks and bags of cement. The guards were cruel, used violence for the slightest disobedience. Magda saw other prisoners being beaten. She saw deaths from diseases and exhaustion. She understood that if she didn't find a way out, she would die here within a few months. In September 2021, the camp owners tried to sell Magda further. They contacted criminal networks that smuggle people to Europe. A buyer was found in Italy, looking for white women for brothels. The deal amount was 10,000 euros. Documents for Magda were forged. She was photographed. A fake passport was made. The plan was smuggle her by sea to Italy on one of the boats with migrants, hand her over to the buyer there. Magda learned about this plan from one of the guards who spoke English. She understood that if she ended up in Italy in the hands of human traffickers, there would be no chances of release at all. On September 23rd, a group of 30 people, including Magda, was loaded into a truck and driven to the coast. The journey took several hours. They were brought to a fishing village where a rubber boat stood on the shore, overcrowded with people. These were mostly Africans, migrants from Somalia, Eritrea, Nigeria, trying to reach Europe. Magda was shoved into the boat with the others. In total, there were about 100 people in the boat, although it was designed for a maximum of 50. Everyone was given life jackets, but half of them were defective. The boat was taken out to sea and left. People were given direction coordinates and told that in a few hours, a vessel would pick them up. The boat floated in the open sea for about 6 hours. The weather was relatively calm, waves small. Magda sat in the middle of the boat, squeezed on all sides by other people. Many prayed, someone cried, children screamed. The boat's motor worked at its limit, stalled several times. Toward evening, a vessel appeared in the distance. It was an Italian Coast Guard patrol ship. They patrolled these waters, intercepting boats with migrants. When the ship approached, they lowered boats, began evacuating people from the rubber boat. Magda was lifted aboard one of the last. On the ship, everyone was placed on the deck, given water, food, warm blankets. Medics examined people, provided first aid. Magda was in shock, exhausted, dehydrated. When Italian officers began questioning the rescued, ascertaining identities, Magda said she was a Polish citizen, that she had been kidnapped in Egypt 5 months ago. The officers initially didn't believe her, thought she was making up a story to get asylum. But she gave her details, passport number which she remembered by heart, parents' names, address in Warsaw. The officers checked the information through Interpol databases. Magda was indeed listed as missing since April 2021. She was immediately separated from the other migrants, placed in a separate cabin. A doctor was called. They contacted the Polish consulate in Rome. The next day, September 24th, the ship arrived at the port of Lampedusa, an Italian island in the Mediterranean Sea that serves as the first reception point for migrants. Magda was handed over to representatives of the Polish consulate. She was taken to a hospital on the island, where she spent 3 days under medical observation. Physically, she was exhausted, had multiple minor injuries, infections, but no serious damage. Her psychological state was severe. She was in post-traumatic shock. On September 27th, Magda was transferred to Rome, where her parents, who had flown from Poland, met her. It was an emotional meeting. The mother cried, hugged her daughter, couldn't believe she was alive. The father stood silently, unable to speak. Magda also cried, for the first time in 5 months, allowing herself to show emotions. That same day, they flew to Warsaw. At home, Magda gave her first statements to the Polish police. She told everything she remembered. The kidnapping, the road in the desert, the first Bedouin family, the sail, the camp in Libya, the boat. She described people, places, events in as much detail as possible. The Polish police passed the information to their Egyptian colleagues. the investigation into the case resumed with new vigor. Now it was definitely known that the girls had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. The Egyptian authorities began an operation to search for Kasia, who was still in captivity. Magda gave a description of the area where she was held the first weeks, but didn't know exact coordinates. Investigators used satellite maps, tried to determine possible places from her descriptions. They began a new round of questioning Bedouins in the region, but another 3 months passed without result. Kasia was still not found. The Egyptian police conducted raids in several Bedouin settlements, but each time either got false information or arrived too late. Bedouins warned each other about approaching police through mobile phones and radios. When police appeared in a settlement, all suspicious people were already hidden or moved. The system of mutual guarantee among Bedouin clans worked effectively. In December 2021, a breakthrough occurred. One of the Bedouins, who had debts to the authorities, agreed to become an informant in exchange for dropping charges. He knew about the existence of several European women held in the desert by various families. According to his information, one of them could be Kasia. She was in a very remote settlement where few people go. The informant gave approximate coordinates and agreed to show the way. On December 8th, the Egyptian police organized an operation. A group of 20 special unit officers in several SUVs set out into the desert led by the informant. They drove at night to avoid attention. The journey took about 4 hours. They approached the settlement at dawn, surrounded the houses, entered with rifles. In one of the houses, they found a white woman in Bedouin clothing working at the well. She was frightened by the armed men, tried to run, but was stopped. When asked her name, she first remained silent, then said in Polish, "Ka!" It was a shock to everyone. Kasia looked completely different from the photos from April. She was exhausted, tanned to blackness, in rags, hair matted and dirty, but it was her. The officers wrapped her in a blanket, led her out of the house. Saleh's family did not resist, understanding there was nowhere to run. All adult family members were arrested on the spot, put in cars. The children were left under the supervision of relatives from a neighboring settlement. The group returned to Hurghada by lunch. Kasia was taken to a hospital, where she spent a week under medical observation. Her physical condition was severe. Severe exhaustion, dehydration, multiple skin infections, worms, avitaminosis. Her psychological condition was even worse. She could barely speak, couldn't concentrate, constantly cried. Psychologists diagnosed acute post-traumatic stress disorder. She was afraid to be alone in a room, afraid of men, couldn't sleep music at night. These were classic symptoms of prolonged captivity and slavery. Kasia's parents flew to Hurghada on December 15th. The meeting with their daughter was difficult. Kasia didn't recognize them right away, looked detached, as if not understanding what was happening. Only after a few hours, when her mother hugged her and began speaking in Polish, something clicked in her mind, and she burst into sobs. It was catharsis, the release of emotions accumulated over 8 months. Doctors gave her a sedative. Music. On December 20th, the family flew to Warsaw. In Poland, both girls began a long recovery process. Magda recovered faster. She spent 5 months in captivity. And although the ordeals were severe, psychologically she held up stronger. Kasia spent 8 months in slavery in harsher conditions, without hope of release. Her psyche was broken more deeply. She visited a psychotherapist 3 times a week, took antidepressants, underwent rehabilitation. Gradually, very slowly, she began to return to normal life, but full recovery was impossible. Scars remained forever, both physical and psychological. Both girls gave detailed statements to the Polish prosecutor's office. Their statements were passed to the Egyptian authorities for criminal prosecution of the kidnappers. In Egypt, a case was opened under articles for kidnapping, human trafficking, illegal deprivation of liberty. More than 10 people were arrested. Members of 2 Bedouin families who held the girls, intermediaries who organized the sale, and the guide Ahmed, who was finally found in February 2022. He was tracked by a mobile phone he used to contact relatives. He was arrested in Cairo, where he was hiding with acquaintances. The investigation in Egypt lasted about a year. They collected evidence, questioned witnesses, conducted examinations. The case was complex because most events occurred in remote areas without witnesses, documents, records. The main evidence was the victim's statements and confessions of some accused. Salah, the old man who held Kasia in the last months, partially admitted guilt. He said he bought the girl for housework, not understanding it was a crime. In his understanding, it was a normal deal. Other accused completely denied guilt, claimed they knew nothing about the kidnapping, that the girls came to them voluntarily. The defense of the accused was built on the assertion that Bedouin society traditions allow buying workers, that it was not slavery in the legal sense, but a form of labor contract, albeit unofficial. Lawyers referred to the fact that the girls were provided with food and shelter in exchange for work, that this is a common practice in desert areas. However, the prosecution insisted that the girls were held against their will, deprived of freedom of movement, forced to work without pay, which is slavery according to the Egyptian Criminal Code and international conventions. The key accused was the guide Ahmed. It was he who organized the kidnapping, lured the girls into the desert under the guise of a tourist excursion, received money from the kidnappers. During interrogations, he initially denied everything, claimed he just drove the tourists to the village at their request, and then they decided to stay themselves. But investigators found records of bank transfers to his account in the period after the kidnapping. The amounts did not match his official income. They also found correspondence in a messenger with one of the kidnappers, where deal details were discussed. Under the pressure of evidence, Ahmed began giving statements. He said he worked for a criminal network that had been kidnapping tourists for several years. His task was to find suitable victims, mainly young women traveling without men, lure them into the desert, and hand them over to kidnappers. For each successful operation, he received from $2,000 to $3,000. Over 3 years, he organized the kidnapping of 7 tourists from different countries. Kasia and Magda were the last on this list. This information shocked the investigation. It meant there were other victims. The prosecutor's office began checking data on missing tourists from 2018 to 2021. They found 5 cases where foreign women disappeared in the Hurghada area under similar circumstances. 2 of them were from Ukraine, 1 from Romania, 2 from Russia. All came for vacation, took desert excursions, after which they disappeared without a trace. Their cases were closed as accidents or voluntary disappearances. Now it became clear that all of them could have been victims of the same criminal network. The Egyptian authorities launched a large-scale operation to search for these women, using information from Ahmed and other arrested, combing desert areas, checking hundreds of Bedouin settlements. Over 3 months from March to May 2022, they found 3 more women. One Ukrainian woman, 28 years old, was found in a settlement hundreds of kilometers from the city of Safaga. She spent 2 years in captivity, working for a Bedouin family. Her mental state was critical. The second girl, a 23-year-old Russian, was found in the area between Hurghada and El Qusir. She was in captivity for a year and 4 months. The third, a 31-year-old Romanian, was discovered by chance during a police raid on another case. She had been in slavery for 3 years and 2 months, the longest. Her physical and psychological condition was so severe that long-term hospitalization was required. The other 2 women from the list were not found. According to statements from Ahmed and other accused, one of them died in captivity from illness about a year after the kidnapping. The second was sold across the border to Sudan. Further fate unknown. The Egyptian prosecutor's office sent a request to Sudanese authorities, but there was no response. Sudan at that time was experiencing an internal political crisis after a military coup. International cooperation was minimal. The trial of the accused began in July 2022 at the Hurghada Criminal Court. The case was considered by a panel of 3 judges. 13 people were on the defendant's bench. Guide Ahmed, members of Bedouin families who held the girls, intermediaries who organized the sale. The charges included kidnapping, human trafficking, illegal deprivation of liberty, forced labor. The maximum penalty under these articles reached life imprisonment. The process lasted 3 months. The prosecution presented an extensive evidence base. Victim statements, confessions of some accused, bank records, messenger correspondence, witness testimonies. The defense tried to challenge the victims' statements, claiming they were under stress and could be mistaken in details. Tried to present the accused Bedouins as simple people not understanding laws, living by ancient traditions. But the facts were irrefutable. Examinations confirmed that the girls were held in conditions corresponding to the definition of slavery. Medical reports showed traces of prolonged physical labor, malnutrition, violence. On October 23, 2022, exactly 18 months after the kidnapping, the court announced the verdict. Ahmed received 25 years in prison. This was the harshest sentence, considering his central role in organizing the crimes. Heads of Bedouin families who bought the girls received from 15 to 20 years. Intermediaries received from 10 to 15 years. Wives of the family heads, who directly controlled the girls and forced them to work, received from 7 to 12 years. All accused were assigned large fines, which were to go as compensation to the victims. Although actually collecting this money was almost impossible, as most of the convicted had no property. The verdict was harsh by Egyptian standards. Usually, cases involving Bedouins were resolved more leniently, taking into account cultural features. But in this case, international pressure and public resonance forced the court to impose an exemplary punishment. The defense filed an appeal, but the appellate court in February 2023 upheld the verdict, only slightly reducing the terms for some secondary figures. This story shows the dark side of the tourism industry, which is rarely spoken about openly. Every year, millions of people travel to exotic countries, trusting their safety to local companies and guides. Most return home with wonderful memories, but there are those who face a reality where human life has a price, where criminals use tourists' trust for profit. The case of Kasia and Magda became a symbol of this problem, a reminder that even in popular tourist destinations, there are dangers that many do not suspect.